most people who have written about vaccines have documented that it takes normally 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. And that goes through the phases of, as I mentioned earlier, preclinical testing, but then phase 1, 2, 3 testing, and each of them takes a couple of years, so that the normal trajectory is somewhere between 5 and 10 years. In COVID, what we've seen is an acceleration of this process, so that in the first 6 to 9 months, we're seeing not only preclinical testing, but phase 1 testing and phase 2 testing, and we've already gotten several vaccine candidates into phase 3 testing, with the goal, as you've heard, I'm sure, on the news, of getting a vaccine sometime in the early part of 2021 or even at the end, by the end of this year. So this has been described by some as pandemic speed, and CEPI, or the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, has written about the possibility of expediting vaccine development in SARS-CoV-2 because of the science, because of the things that we've learned from previous infections, from previous coronavirus infections, and the vaccine science and the platforms that we now have available to us to create vaccines. Operation Warp Speed, as you may know, is the U.S. government program, which has a goal of producing and delivering 300 million doses of safe and effective vaccines as early as January of 2021, as part of a broader strategy to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of countermeasures against COVID. And it's a partnership among Department of Health and Human Services components, including CDC, NIH, BARDA, ASPR, and the Department of Defense, and engagement with private firms and other federal agencies. Operation Warp Speed has selected promising candidates and then invested in those candidates to the tune of billions of dollars in developing and manufacturing them even before the studies are complete. And they are also working on a strategy for distribution of these vaccines once we find a safe and effective one. So Warp Speed is not a misnomer, because vaccine research started within weeks of identifying and sequencing the SARS-CoV-2. Sequencing took place in January, and by March we had the first vaccine candidate in a phase 1 clinical trial. And in October of 2020, where we are now, there are more than 200 vaccine candidates in the pipeline. We also noted in a publication that I did with some of my colleagues in the Department of Bioethics that shortcuts in vaccine development and testing might expedite the timeline of scientific progress, but also could result in compromising the quality, the acceptability, and the ethics. And many others have worried about this. There have been articles like this one in a number of different venues that say the risks of rushing a COVID vaccine are exposing all of us to unnecessary danger. A group at NYU wrote a paper in JAMA that they also talked about the adverse consequences of rushing a vaccine and implications of rushing for public trust. And what they concluded was what cannot and must not be allowed is for desperation to result in the suspension of scientific principles and ethical research values. On the other hand, as CEPI has pointed out, there are ways to expedite the process without compromising the quality or the ethics. And they talked about, for example, combining phases and also making sure that the manufacturing, development, and scale-up happened in parallel with the development of vaccines. This is unprecedented in the history of vaccine development. So, in the beginning, there were multiple approaches proposed for testing SARS-CoV-2 vaccines quickly, for accelerated testing. One was accelerated randomized controlled trials. Some people talk about combining phases, as I just showed you with the CEPI slide. There were people who talked about variations on the RCT design, primarily because in the Ebola epidemic, the effective vaccine was found by doing a ring vaccination strategy. Many people wrote about controlled human infection studies as a method to accelerate the pace of vaccine development. And I'm not going to say really anything more about them because the people following me today are going to be talking about controlled human infection studies for COVID. And then there were proposals early on to approve a vaccine through an emergency use authorization so it would be widely distributed to the public, even before there were efficacy data on certain vaccines. Some of this is guided by FDA guidance. The FDA has put out 2 very extensive and very important pieces of guidance about vaccine trials in COVID. The first was issued in June of 2020. And basically in that document, it says that in order to have a vaccine that will be submitted to the FDA, either for licensure or for granting an emergency use authorization, that the vaccine has to have at least 50% efficacy on its primary endpoint. And the document that was published by the FDA in October of this year just has further details about how they will make decisions about emergency use authorization for vaccines, very clearly stating that the benefits have to clearly outweigh the risks.